Welcome to Disrupted Science, the occasional conversation between the authors of the forthcoming book, How the Internet Disrupted Science. I'm Kent Anderson, and it's May 29th, Thursday of the year 2025.
And I'm Joy Moore. Hey, everyone.
So we're doing this as a test run. If you see it, that means it went well. If you don't, that means that the next one will be the one you see. So we'll see how this goes. But Joy and I wanted to do this because we talk every day and we're putting the final touches on the book, and we thought these conversations might be interesting to people.
That's right. There's a lot of taking a step back, kind of looking in from the outside, which has been a really good experience. Now that we have so many more eyeballs on scholarly content, members of the public, people in the government, people all over the place. It's good to get some perspective from a few meters back and say, what's going on? What are people seeing? And then what does it mean based on what we know about how the industry works and how things are put together behind the scenes?
Right.
So we've had a lot of back and forth about a lot of things, but for today, I think we want to talk about a couple of key points. There's been some themes in the Geyser post over the last couple of weeks that we can tease out a little bit more. So let's start with listicles, shall we?
Not my favorite word, but yes, let's do it.
And so when we say listicles, they're widgets, a lot of them about most read, most cited. Most of the platforms have them, counters of all sorts, but particularly the ones that we want to hone in on today are the ones that are reflecting what are the most popular articles on a platform or within a journal. And what we can learn from looking at these articles and the amount of traffic that they're getting.
Right. And why it may not always be a good thing. It may actually be a kind of a cause of concern when you have something that really spikes, because I think one of the things we've been talking about is how the information environment is not can't be presumed safe these days.
Mhm.
So,
So which one do we want to start with?
well, I mean, we Joy and I kind of did a back and forth looking across a few implementations of this. One was at New England Journal of Medicine. We liked that one. It didn't have counts on it. It seemed like a pretty, a nicely designed, kind of fits into the page, doesn't there's nothing sensationalistic about it. It just kind of lists things, and there aren't numbers, so you don't get a sense of whether the scale is, distance between 1 and 3 is big or small. And it's just a list. And plus, they have a business model where it really is more of a community measure than anything else, and or maybe an editorial decision measure, because one of the top articles was the one by Bhattacharya and the head of the FDA, where they were talking about some of the changes they were making in their priorities. And that, that hit the press, and NEJM did that intentionally as an editorial decision and made it free as an editorial decision. So everybody could see what these two people had in their minds. But, then we looked at, I think, Altmetric, and they had
Mhm.
an interesting design. And I can put some of these little things in, I can sprinkle them in the video, where they listed them side left to right, which was
Mhm.
interesting. And they called it trending. And, that was okay, I guess. But still, all the altmetric problems are there. We know there are a lot of kind of weighting issues and source issues with some of those metrics, but it still also seemed to be chasing a popular story was at the top. And then
Mhm.
we got to a couple to JAMA, and that's where I think some of our red flags started to fly, at least in
Uh-huh.
as I recollect the conversations. But you go ahead, you can
Yeah.
about that.
So Um, the key thing is that, this is information that's basically marketing. They're byproducts of the platform. They're more than likely, 100% automated. It's unlikely that there are any human beings who are involved in what's actually displayed, right? These have all been programmed through feeds and set through algorithms and meters.
Right.
And
And
that's nice.
JAMAs, you can actually grab the RSS feed of each one.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
And they were designed that way.
Mhm.
And they were designed in order to let visitors to the platform know what's being read. And certainly once you get into the different verticals within the journals or in different subject areas, you're going to get narrower and narrower returns.
Right.
And the intent behind a lot of these way back in the day when they were being designed was to help the reader and give some narrowing in terms of if you're here on this page and that you're interested in this stuff, let us let you know what the people who came here before you were really interested in. And so it's making some assumptions about the user intent inherent in the design
Right.
of the
And
widget
the scope of the community too, right?
and the scope of the community. Exactly.
Right.
Um, and then when we go to the ones that are open now, years later, um, we're seeing a lot more variance, a lot more wild cards. And if you're familiar with the content within these publications and on these platforms, they really jump out at you.
Hmm. And
And
when you say open, you're talking about the open access,
yeah, the open access
right?
ones, the
Journals and
ones
articles
that
and
have
hybrids.
right. These articles have become part of the open web ecosystem in ways that they wouldn't necessarily have been before.
Right.
And there's seamless links through all sorts of channels from press releases to news articles to someone coming in through PubMed, through all the spider web that is how scholarly content is connected.
Right.
And so you're seeing this artifact of these page view counts change dramatically than how it was before when it wasn't so easy and lots of eyeballs weren't driven to these platforms in the same ways by the same outside forces.
Right.
And the Nijim one is really nice in that it reflects, like you said, a true community use, right? That
Hmm.
traffic is driven by people who are either members or paid individual subscribers or accessing it through an institution who has paid for it. And this isn't a conversation about whether or not it's good to charge subscriptions. That's not where
Right.
I'm going.
Right.
But what it does show you is that the people who are accessing the full text are there for a reason. And the content that is published is a limited amount of select content that Nijim uh, publishes every
Right.
week. And so you have more when you're looking at this data being displayed through these widgets, you're looking at a feedback loop within a community. We chose
Right.
this content for this audience, and this is what this audience thinks of it.
Right. So safer assumptions about the scope and intent of the community and therefore a little bit more legitimacy around the rankings or the ordering of most popular because they don't actually show you the numbers. You don't know what those are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so for the other ones that are being run across much broader, much disparate content sets,
Hmm.
and then they have to squeeze them down into a list of 5, 10, or however deep you want to go. You're going from thousands and thousands of articles being looked at by we don't even know how many users,
Right.
and that's putting a lot of strain on that algorithm to create something that is meaningful in any kind of historical editorial way. This is
Right.
pure internet stuff
Right.
that's coming in from all over the place.
Yeah. But even
And
at that, we saw things just pop, right?
yeah.
I mean,
Hmm.
in a way that was disproportionate.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of got us on this thing, especially because when we looked at the content, it's like, oh,
No.
see? And that might not be what you were hoping you were getting out there.
Hmm. And so these are clues that we've been following, and either from hearing about something out in the world, like I found out about the golf course article, from
Right. So
somebody.
just to
Yeah.
pause on that. So one of the articles that popped was in which JAMA journal was that in?
JAMA Open.
JAMA Open, right. So it was asserting an association between living near a golf course and developing Parkinson's disease, right?
Mhm.
The lead author is a geographer. We looked at some of the criticism of the article, and they hadn't done any blood tests. They hadn't taken into account that Parkinson's takes 10 to 15 years to develop after an exposure. So they didn't know how long the people had lived there. And, there were a lot of concerns about the quality of the science, the qualifications, or even the basic assumptions of making a geographical, correlation like that. And and you came across it because it popped to the top of that list, right? And that's what got us kind of nosing around in it.
Yeah, that's right. And well, I didn't find out about it because I was looking at JAMA and seeing what was hot. I found out about it because a friend of mine said, "What's Joe Rogan doing talking about JAMA?"
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's where we get to kind of the crux of the issue, right?
Yeah.
Because what seems to be happening, and this is where it gets into the open web aspect of this, is that there's a little, not a little, it's a pretty big industry of people who are taking open access scientific content and bending it to their will. I mean, this might be a useful article in a small community setting of people looking at Parkinson's disease and environmental factors. And it might be a marginal contribution. It might be ignored by most people, but
Hmm.
it can spark a conspiracy theory, right? Or it feeds into this sort of what's really hot right now with RFK, and we'll talk about him in a little bit, is that, environmental sources are the main reasons that we have all of our health woes and, why we have fat kids and why we die instead of being immortal and all of those things. So it just fed into that, and that's why it showed up on Joe Rogan, right?
Hmm. Well, that's one of the reasons why it showed up on Joe Rogan. And we can't say for sure. But who's the last author on that paper, Kent?
Oh yeah, yeah. So he's not the last author, but so one of the authors in the paper is a guy named Ray Dorsey. He's a physician, and he's done a lot of work in the area of Parkinson's and all of that. But if you look at his disclosures, it's a mile long. I mean, we've all worked, I think a lot of us in medical publishing have worked with doctors like this there's a colorful nickname for them, but I'm not going to use it. But they're busy people and they're making a lot of friends, um, usually with money transacted. So he has a long list of people that he's involved with, but he didn't disclose two things. One, that he's the director for the Center of Brain and Environment at a place called Atria Health and Research Institute, which is a for-profit LLC.
It's a functional medicine
Mm.
practice
Network, right?
chain. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a practice network of functional medicine
Hmm.
doctors, and we can talk about functional medicine as sort of a thing at some point, but it seems to be the hot term for people who want to be doctors without having all the constraints you might have on you if you were a doctor, even if you are a doctor.
Hmm.
And then he's also the author of a forthcoming book called The Parkinson's Plan, A New Path to Prevention and Treatment, which is coming out from a Hachette imprint later this year. And we looked at some of the timing, and it seemed like, the timing was convenient, let's just say. If it wasn't planned, he was very lucky. But he didn't disclose any of those things in the JAMA paper. So that was another little flag on this. But it ended up getting like almost, I don't know, 100 times, 80 times more traffic, the visits than the next paper,
Hmm.
or maybe, or is that the other one? Maybe this was more like 10 times
Yeah.
because it was open, but a lot, and it just jumped out. And, so it's feeding this environment that in writing the book, we're coming across more and more, which is this kind of shadow environmental supplements, nutraceutical, functional medicine area that now is moving centrally because of RFK Jr. into dictating how Americans can take care of themselves.
Hmm.
And so it's very timely that this has happened as well, because it shows how these people are just inserting themselves in things, and how big their media space is, how powerful it is. This paper comes out and it's picked up by one of their amplifiers, Joe Rogan, and then Dorsey's going to have a book and all of this. So this whole thing is already being spun in a way that has we tracked articles where people are like, should I move if I live near a golf course? And
Hmm.
will my home value go down because of this paper? And so on and so forth. So it's creating waves in society because it's been amplified through those networks. And I think so in talking about it, one of the things was, our publishers looking at these as potentially early warning systems, ways to catch these things when they start before they spin out of control. Can you do anything about it? And it raised the question, we couldn't think of a good way to handle it. So why do you even have these lists, was kind of our take on it at this point, because it's such a dangerous game. You're basically putting a fork in the outlet sometimes and hoping it's not on every time, but a lot of times it's on.
Hmm. Well, yeah, it just goes back to the intent, right? So, we started off by talking about, these lists of most popular, why they were originally put there, what service they had for the users, and certainly to kind of drive traffic, to things that people are looking at. And there's not really necessarily any editorial intent. But again, going back and looking at these sites with the eyeballs of somebody who isn't familiar, with journal publishing, that looks like an advertisement.
Hmm.
That looks like something that is important. It looks intentional, whether it was or wasn't.
Right.
And so that's kind of the area that I've been thinking about, a lot more, is what is the intent? What is the editorial intent? Or what is the publishing intent of a lot of these things on these platforms? And are they serving the use, today that, editors and publishers really want?
Right. I
Um,
mean, even if JAMA were to just remove the numbers, that would quiet it down quite a bit, right? It would take a lot of sort of it would just make the list look a lot quieter, from a visual standpoint, and probably not spin so much out. But then you have these, you can't control the links that are incoming from Joe Rogan's podcast, which
yeah.
has millions and millions of followers. So there's also an editorial question of, you know, do you have to be more careful with what you publish, knowing that there are um, opportunists lurking for this kind of stuff? And I think that's a whole different topic. But
Hmm.
but we also came across another example, right, where that's even more brazen with the fluoride and IQ paper, which
Yeah.
that one had, from my armchair quarterbacking it, that had red flags all over it and should have been stopped, like
Yeah.
from a scientific and a social perspective. But
Mhm.
but that one also popped up on the list because it was exploited by conspiracy theorists. And then you found that it was even used in testimony in a town in Canada, right?
It went all the way to Saskatchewan,
Right.
and it was cited in the minutes of a town board meeting, where a small town in Saskatchewan had finally gotten to the point where they were about to put fluoride in their drinking water. They hadn't had it before,
Mm,
and they had the infrastructure ready to go, and they had the money to do it. And at the last minute, some of their citizens found out about this study and tried to stop the whole thing, but also echoing the same language that we're hearing, which is until there's conclusive proof that this is not harmful,
right.
we don't feel comfortable with it. And
Right.
that is the effect that paper had on the public when it was picked up and run with by news outlets all over the place.
Yep.
And so this is the language that we're hearing, and this is what people who are trying to make decisions for themselves within their community, in their local governments, but also who are phoning, their representatives, um, are getting this false sense that scientific information proves things 100% or disproves them 100%. And as long as there's, enough papers to stack up one against the other, these debates are going to be
Well, and
really
what they've
fun.
done, I think, is the art of their, they've flipped it so you have to prove a negative, right?
Right,
So you have to prove it's absolutely safe.
right,
And I can't prove water's absolutely safe, right? So
right.
that's the game. And so they just keep sowing doubt. But even if you look at the paper, so the last author on this one, this was my real friend, John Butcher. Um, and he back
This is a US government sponsored paper, by the
Yeah,
way.
so right,
Yeah.
yeah. So this is an NIH funded
Mhm.
paper in effect. So, this was another thing RFK was on about this week is that NIH, if you're an NIH funded scientist, you are in the club. You can publish whatever you want. And we'll talk a little bit about um I think your joke was we were talking about the former Journal of Universal Rejection, which was a hilarious little send up some years back where they said, this one's even harder to get into than any of the others because you're already rejected. You can submit it to another journal even when you submit it here because you're already rejected. And, then we looked at the new Bhattacharya and RFK kind of adjacent journal. And that one, if you just are a member of their really old boys club, you automatically can publish there. And that was kind of what RFK was saying about NIH funding. If you have an NIH grant, so they're playing this very obvious game, and it's always in the open because there just is so much stuff going on, no one can respond. But they're
Mhm.
cutting grants to people they don't like. They're going to give grants to people they like. They're going to have those in-house organs publishing these things. But this John Butcher, he had gotten a $25 million grant to study cell phone radiation and brain cancer, and it came up with a paper about rats that nobody wanted. He couldn't get it published anywhere, so he posted it as a preprint. It made a little bit of a splash. A New York Times reporter uh, who was a physician, caught it and said, "Wait, this paper is garbage, and you shouldn't pay any attention to it." He was the first media outlet to do that, to actually be skeptical about it, and it stopped it. But now he's back with this IQ and fluoride paper, and which is, bothers me because I remember when I was, knee high to a grasshopper, that was the conspiracy theory my parents laughed at, right? Fluoride, yeah, right. You're crazy if you think that. But it emanates from a 1937, journal that was founded then. and someone who was adamant in, that this was a thing. And it ended up that a lot of the papers cited in the meta-analysis came from that journal,
Mhm.
which is a one, it's their hobby horse, right? Everything that goes wrong. But then, IQ is just a red flag for for a lot of things that shouldn't be talked about as a way to evaluate whether something is good for you or bad for you because it has a bad history. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean,
I mean, like
as
you
we
said,
were,
it's not a
I,
vital sign.
yeah, I said, wait a second, did I miss a memo? When did IQ become a vital sign?
Yeah, I'd be at the doctor every day going, "What's wrong with
Right?
mine?"
Yeah, and so it is inherently subjective.
Right.
Um, and
And
and we
culturally
don't need to
constrained,
go
and you can go
into,
into all that.
yeah, we don't need to go into all of that, but it's again, it's one of these, dog whistle words. And
Right.
of course, nobody wants their kids to be dumber than they would have been if they drink the water.
Right.
But this is not whatever the data set of IQs they're using to compare, you know, what is that? This is not something that's in your EHRs. Where is this stored? Why are we even talking about this?
Right. Right.
And if, like you said before, this study, if it could be useful for somebody else who wants to look into this same thing, but it's certainly not appropriate um, for making decisions. And we've already seen this not only in Saskatchewan, but in Florida.
Right.
And the story behind the authors, and we've seen other bits of their work over the years, like you mentioned, really trying, and I think in good faith, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
They're working for an institute of the NIH that is tasked with understanding what things in our environment might harm us. They're doing that for and on behalf of the American public. That's good.
Hmm.
But spreading fear and alarm is not the way to solve problems from a scientific point of view, and certainly not from a public health point of view, but it works pretty damn well when you're trying to make policy. And
Right.
that's what this is adding up to. And so for this paper, and the golf course paper, you know, from the publishing perspective, the editorial perspective, the disclosures of who funded it, who did they work for, with the exception of Dorsey, everything was totally above board,
Right.
by the book. The data was there, everything was clear.
Right.
They submitted and were accepted, presuming by all the requirements as set out by the journal's aims and scopes. And I'm assuming that they were peer reviewed and they were accepted
Mhm.
according to the acceptance criteria for those journals. The JAMA Pediatrics one was it was open access in a hybrid situation. And so
Right.
the authors had the right to pay to make their article open.
Yeah.
And then the other one was in the fully open journal.
Right.
So everything is gone by the book, according to the journal guidelines and the business rules.
Right.
But what we're seeing is when you add that together and you amplify it through a platform that is picked up by outside forces that cannot be controlled, you come up with a very different story than you probably thought you were going to be telling when those articles were first submitted.
Right, right. And the other thing I'll just note, I know that Cope recently made a recommendation that journals should disclose who pays the APC for open access articles. I think that that's one missing piece here. I would love to know that it was an NIH, grant, a piece of an NIH grant that paid for it rather than Dorsey's, one of his for-profit entities, or, somebody, you just don't know. And not
Hmm.
knowing, you can think the worst. And I think most publishers are careful about that, but why not disclose it? It seems like it's part of what the journals do, is to increase transparency. So, but there's another, this doesn't have to do necessarily with and I'll just mention it briefly with the widgets, but the other one that came across was the spoon in my brain paper.
Hmm.
And that one, just from a public communication standpoint, was appalling for the scientists. And this was the same NIH branch. But the scientist in the paper said, these do not establish a causal role for such particles affecting health. But then when he was putting together the press release from his university, he said the findings should trigger alarm.
Yeah.
And that's inappropriate. So I think, that's another thing
Well, just
that,
to be fair, Kent, he's
yeah,
alarmed. He, from his perspective in his lab and for his personal motivations and professional motivations for doing this research, what he found is significant enough to warrant further research, and he
mhm.
personally is alarmed. Now,
But should you say that in public?
right.
And if you
Um,
don't, and if your findings don't bear that out, if you don't say it
right.
in the paper. So I get you, I understand.
Yeah.
But I still think you have to have that. I think there's an intentionality to that in the setting that is
Yeah.
is a little bit of a tell, as far as, you know, I just don't think it was appropriate. You know,
No, it wasn't. And that's why we have journals, lots of journals that are publishing research at different phases in the maturity
right.
of when it gets to changing policy
Yeah.
or creating something new that is actually going to affect you and me. And
Right.
so maybe someday we might find out
He was
that
right.
he was
Maybe.
right.
Yeah.
And we're not saying that he wasn't right on whatever it is he did with those brains and what he found. That's not really our job. Whose job it is are the members of his peers in
Mhm.
his area of research to
Right.
either continue to build on that science or to say that wasn't helpful, we're going to go in another direction.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
I
so,
do think I think that, one of the things we're finding in writing the book is just how hot how hair trigger the media space has gotten,
mhm,
because the news cycle is minutes, right? It used to be days, now it's
mhm,
minutes. And so everything's amped up. Every bit of coverage is, full of adjectives and adverbs and all sorts of, scare words and alarmism, because it has to cut through the clutter, and there's so much, it's all clutter.
mhm,
So, I think that's where kind of we get back to the listicles, is their sort of UX clutter, and, decluttering them like NEJM does nicely, taking numbers out, just letting them kind of be quietly there as a guidepost if you want to use them, just to spark a thought, spark an
mhm,
exploration, but not drive you necessarily in a certain direction.
mhm,
Um, I think that's part of the reason I liked it, is because it's it's a good contrast to this kind of overheated media space. It's like,
mhm.
oh, there's a calm implementation of a list.
It's also good. I mean, I was thinking we're doing a lot of, Wayback Machine kind of research too.
Mm,
And it's good to have a snapshot, right? Someday our great grandchildren are going to look back at 2025 and say, what was going on?
right,
What was this stuff needs to be published, and there needs to be an understanding of where it fits in the scholarly record.
right.
And so that's the other thing to keep in mind, is this what we want to be putting down for the future for people to look back on
Right.
and learn from.
Yeah.
And so yes, for the UX clutter of it all, if these types of things are achieving what you're looking for as a publisher editorially and in terms of your publishing goals, I mean, that's up to you. I mean, we're just holding a mirror up and saying, it might be worth taking time to stop and think.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's
Because
a
once
spot
it
you might
gets
want to
out,
revisit. Yeah.
yeah, there aren't enough, good journalists and um excellent people on social media who are trying to debunk things. Once it gets out, it's out.
Mhm.
And there's nothing that you as a publisher or editorially can do to rein it back in.
Yeah. So let's move on to another topic that kind of we can pivot from. We've been talking about NEJM and JAMA, and someone else was this week, our favorite person, RFK Jr.
Get out of
Um,
here. Stop it.
sorry, I had to say it. I had to say it. I know.
No, I mean, he needs to just go
Oh,
focus on something else.
right,
Oh.
right. Yeah. So he was interviewed on a wellness guru. What would you call Gary Brecka? So
Well, so Gary Brecka,
let's hear
if
about Gary
if
Brecka.
folks aren't familiar with Gary Brecka, he is a human biologist by training. I don't really know what that means, but he's not a doctor, but he is an entrepreneur and
He is.
he's he's very well connected in circles of people who make a lot of money by
Right.
promoting seminars and how to get rich quick.
Right.
And
In the secondary health media space, right?
well, right. And but also
The
um
wellness media space.
yes, and he really um got ahead in business when he became friends with Dana White,
Right.
who's um in that man boxing thing that they do.
MMA.
Yeah, MMA. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
He helped him get fit and trim and ripped and
Right.
jacked and all that stuff. He also Dana was also taking Ozempic at the same time. I hear. Don't quote me on that.
Okay. Well,
So
too late. You're on video now. So,
anyway, so Gary, so anyway, he sits atop of a company called
mhm.
10x and
Mhm.
the goal is to 10x your life.
Right.
And so it's exercise regimens, it's red light saunas, it's a lot of expensive things
Right.
within the narrative of you can biohack your way to being a better person.
Right.
Um,
Oxygen's a big thing for him.
yes, oxygen and lots of other things
Right.
like that.
Right.
And so they've got a huge following. And so his not only his customers through his franchised gyms and all the products that he sells, but also the overall kind of wellness space of these different podcasters and influencers and supplement
Right.
salespeople um, are all friends with RFK Jr. And so,
And appropriately, this was recorded apparently right before the two of them were going to go to an MMA fight in Miami back in April. Uh,
oh,
and so and why they held it until May, I don't know. We have a speculation that was because RFK was also announcing he was going to stop COVID vaccines that day and wanted a little distraction, but I think it was, I don't know what, it was weird. But in any event, so this was an MMA match that Donald Trump was coming down to. I think who's RFK's wife? She's an actress. She was on,
Cheryl Hines.
yeah, Curb Your Enthusiasm. I like her a lot, but apparently Trump snubbed her in the crowd because she's a Hollywood liberal. But anyhow, during the interview,
She's a very funny Hollywood liberal.
she's great. I love her. But anyhow, the in addition to kind of offhandedly calling being a woman a chronic condition by claiming that the first pill for chronic conditions was the pill during the interview, which was something that kind of flew under the radar. He also called the top medical journals corrupt and, said that he was considering banning NIH scientists from publishing in them. Um,
That's just so cute.
yeah.
Like just the notion of like, you better stop publishing every single one of your papers in the top journals that only accept 2% of everything.
I know. Well,
Knock it
because he
off.
said if you're an NIH, you are already top of the heap, right? You can't be wrong.
Well, but
And
also, I
which is
mean,
the club mentality they have with that other journal, right? Which is
does he not know that there's others
I don't
other
know. I
than,
mean, he thought Marcia Angel was the editor in chief of NEJM for 20 years.
yeah.
She was influential for 20 years, but I don't even know if she was there 20 years. I have to look back, but she was never editor in chief. And there are two other editor in chiefs since she was there. I mean, she wasn't really active this century there, but so he's name checking her and, but yeah, I don't know if he knows how much about scientific publishing at all. Um, but yeah, he might not know. He might think I'm going to take all five medical journals out with this one move. There will be no more medical journals after
Yeah.
this. Yeah, that's a good, it's not implausible. But one of the things that kind of came out of this, a few things, he thinks that it's easy to start a preeminent journal. Um, Not at all true. Um, that the producer of the journal determines whether it's preeminent. Um, that's not true. The consumers of the journal determine whether it's preeminent. And, a whole bunch of other things. But the fact that kind of if the government funds it, the government can control it. It also gets into some academic freedom issues that we've been seeing with um, you know, involving the government in scientific publishing matters. And this kind of idea that there seemed to kind of be between the lines where there was so much an attack on pharma, so much an attack on, FDA doing anything as far as dictating what's safe and what's not safe and so much promotion of supplements and alternative therapies that it almost seemed like the game they were tipping their hand about was we're going to get rid of regulation in pharma. We're going to get rid of these journals that adjudicate science effectively for people. And we're going to flip it so that it's a field, it's just wide open field. And whoever markets the best will win.
Yeah.
And that's going to be supplements for a large proportion of the population. Like we were talking about the other day, most major drugs are taken by a small percentage of the population, right? If you can get a supplement into that small proportion of the population at a comparable margin, not
Hmm.
price, but margin, with no sunk cost to pay off of decades of difficult research and product development and all of that and post-marketing studies and FDA approval and all of that. So you can get it to market fast, you can get it to market cheap. Your margin maybe end up being the same effectively. You can compete effectively with pharma. And so I think that's the grift here is because my theory is there's always a grift with these guys. They're not just ideologically problematic, but they've got a scheme. So
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there, right? There's a network of very strong voices who are heavily invested in direct to consumer stuff that looks like it has to do with health, and whether it's the private concierge functional medicine practices that don't go through insurance. This is cash business,
Right.
whether it's
Flexible spending accounts.
the flexible spending account
Yeah.
guys who are getting in that mix too, and gals. There's and then there's the products that are being sold, but it's all on this promise of empowerment and choice and protection. But what's behind the scenes is just this free for all, free market, reduce the regulations,
Right.
and give people the choice to buy the things that are easiest for us to make money. It
Right.
has nothing to do, as many people have said before, this has nothing to do with health. This has nothing to do with health care.
Right.
Um, and it has really nothing to do with medical journals, honestly.
Well, no,
Um,
but those are secondary regulators in a way, right?
right.
You know, they're
But
regulating I mean, peer review was put in place to blunt government interference after the Manhattan Project, right? And science, when
mhm,
science got big and industrial, and to make it so it was independent of government influence to as great an extent as possible. And so, that's what they're bristling at some level is, you can't tell us what to do. You can't tell
mhm,
us, and that goes back to Ed Martin's letter as well, where he was between the lines saying that if you're not willing to publish, alternative facts or alternative perspectives about medicine, then I'm coming after you. And RFK's old pledges about, trying to take journals down because, racketeering charges, that they were somehow in cahoots with pharma. And he makes
yeah.
that same allegation in this interview. So, I just don't think they like people in the way of their business enterprises.
Right, but they're also um conflating things in a way
Hmm.
that doesn't make real world sense. These, first of all, there are not that many medical journals that are at that level of clinical publication
Right,
where you could actually take action on change your practice or release a new product or change a procedure based on what they published. There
right,
are very few of those.
right.
So that's one thing. The other thing is they don't dictate what people do with it. They're
Okay.
missing the whole chain that goes from a study that's published in NEJM or JAMA or the Lancet that then goes through all the gazillion steps that it does to get to when you go see your doctor
Right,
and she decides to do X instead of Y, which she did before. And
right,
so it's not that the medical journals are going to the doctors and the doctors are changing things. And it's not that the information that they're publishing that is relevant to patients is really helping the patients at the time that it's published.
right. Well, and the other thing, I was interviewed by a reporter from Stat News, and he mentioned that, Kennedy was going after the elite medical journals. And I said, the thing that's kind of funny about that is these are actually the most popular medical journals in a way, right?
Mhm,
Why you want to get published there is because this is what everybody has to read, right? If
mhm.
you don't, they were kind of the populist medical journals that's how they grew. And New England Journal of Medicine famously, went to all the medics coming out of World War II, and that's how it went from a regional journal to a worldwide journal to a national journal, then a worldwide journal.
Oh, I
Lancet,
didn't
the
know
same
that.
thing. It blossomed with World War II because it was shared in that way. And JAMA has the American Medical Association. So these are actually not elite. These are kind of the basic journals.
Mhm,
And I think that's also lost on people who look at the brand power that they have, but that brand power is because so many people know they need to look at them and have found reason to trust them.
mhm.
And that trust, can slip. They make mistakes, but everybody does. They admit their mistakes more often than I think RFK does. But so it was an interesting thing. It'll be interesting to see where they go, RFK mentioned something about open review for these new sensational journals that they're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
The one journal that they did, that Bhattacharya, Jay Bhattacharya was involved with before, again, has a policy that if they accept you as a member of that journal community, you can publish whatever you want. So they aren't evaluating your scientific claims, they're evaluating whether you fit with their club, which is another interesting
Right.
thing and kind of echoes the, well, if you get an NIH grant, then you can publish whatever you want, which is another clubby way of saying that they want to control who
Right.
not pursue a lot of interesting science.
Well, exactly. And that's where this is all adding up to. And so really, yeah, if you are accepted to publish whatever you want because we accepted you into our club, that's called a newsletter for a club,
Right.
or a listserv or
Right.
whatever. Um, that's fine. There's other ways to do it. You don't have to go through this whole dog and pony show of being a journal with peer review if really your goal is to pick what gets funded and from that research output pick what's going to actually be shared with the public, um and where it's going to be shared from. Like
Right.
just skip all that annoying peer
Well, I mean,
reviewed
they
journal
want
stuff.
that's what he did with he ignored all the scientists with the COVID vaccine
Yeah.
decision, and they're why the pretense? I'm absolutely with you on that. We know what you're up to. Why the pretense? Why waste our time? And plus, it also you wonder what Clarivate would do if they started a journal, right? And
Ugh.
who else would get dragged into this whole mess? So,
Don't give them any ideas, Kent. They might be listening.
well, if you are. Listen carefully because you're wrong. So, um, but yeah, there's definitely a top-down aspect to this that can't be ignored. It's not science. You know, it's authority that they're trying to, it's their way or the highway kind of thing, and that's the whole, um, that's everything about this administration. So, we should probably wrap up. We wanted to, a couple of things, a couple of fun discoveries. We'll wrap up with those. We'll just call it fun discoveries for now until we come up with something better. One was in writing about the fluoride paper, I came across the delightful Bonkers Institute for Nearly Genuine Science. Had the disease that I thought was the best of all. They had a mock paper, asymptomatic depression, a hidden epidemic, and a huge untapped market. So if you're suffering from asymptomatic depression, you might want to see a doctor about that. And the other lovely discovery was we found that the Weekly World News, the bastion of grocery store lines in the 80s and 90s that we all loved, still exists.
Yes, and the satire is fantastic.
Oh, I'm
I
madder
had
than a
no
hornet in a
idea.
pickle jar about how not knowing that years ago. Ed Anger's still writing this stuff, and they aren't as busy as The Onion, but it's just reassuring that the Weekly World News is still out there, holding down its corner of the absurd, so that no one else gets it. So,
All right, so that was a lot for our first
yeah,
episode.
yeah, I think we did
We're
okay.
All right, we started with the listicles, right? The
Yeah,
widgets that are showing the counts and what's being clicked on across the platforms.
right.
And that
How
took
those are
us
being
into
influenced, right, by the outside
that,
forces.
yeah, understanding that these are, algorithmically generated bits of informational cues to the users that could probably use a fresh set of eyes in terms of what value is it adding, um, in
Right,
terms of what you're communicating to the world
right,
now that there are a lot more eyeballs on this content.
right.
So that took us into toxic golf courses, fluoride lowering hypothetical IQs, and the spoon worth of
Spoon in our
plastic
brain,
spoon in the brain.
in our creamy
Um,
brains. Yep.
yeah. And again, this is not we're not trying to post facto peer review or not crowdsourcing expert opinions here, and understanding that all three of these papers were published through the perfectly legitimate methods, and that our intent for raising awareness about this is just to, remind folks that a lot more is going on with your content than you might think, and
Right.
you might not want to support that.
Right.
Um, and speaking of things that you might not want to support, we got into RFK Jr., his conversation with Gary Brecka, the 10x Your Body and Life human biologist guru,
Right.
um, and how he decided that in that conversation before going to an MMA fight with Donald Trump, who at that fight offended RFK Jr.'s wife.
Yes.
Before all that happened,
Yes.
he decided to drop right somewhere in the middle of that podcast that all these elite journals were no good, and he didn't want his innovative NIH gold standard scientists publishing in these journals.
Right.
And so what is that going to lead to? They're going to start their own publishing program. What does that even really mean scientifically?
Or will
Um,
they even follow through on it?
or will they even follow through, right?
Yeah.
We can only speculate so much. And it's honestly, is it worth doing a lot of mental gymnastics? No, but is it a good idea to kind of get ready for like the worst that could happen? Probably.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so we'll just keep an eye on what continues to happen with where they're um, maintaining funding. We know what they've cut. They've published the budget, so we can see what's already been cut. Um, but what'll be interesting to see is what they keep in terms of funding, what the outputs of that funding is going to be, how many papers are we actually talking about here at the end of the day once we get through the next round of grants and those papers getting ready to publish. Um,
So
and
you mentioned crowdsourcing. There is actually one interesting little legitimate crowdsourcing wrinkle going on with this, which is
mhm.
somebody put a call out to all the people applying for NIH grants to compile all their grants into a single database and analyze them, um, all the ones that have been denied. So that could be interesting. So
Hmm. Who's
yeah,
behind that?
I'd have to look. It just came up. I,
So is somebody in the government or somebody
no, so
outside the government?
outside,
Oh,
outside.
they want to see who's getting rejected.
Yeah, they want to see
See,
who's
that's
getting.
good.
Yeah,
I want to know about
yeah.
that
I
too.
would made that got me going too. So
I'm gonna opt in on that one. Um, but I'm gonna opt out of a lot of other stuff if I can. Although looking up all these MMA fighters and these weird health stuff has really jacked up my computer. My Google
oh, your
ads
ads
are
are
out of
all
control.
yeah. You're getting some weird ones based on
My
the
listicles are
screenshots.
no bueno. I got bad listicles on my computer. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, you got it's. I'll tell you, it's tough. You got to do a lot of private mode to do writing this book. So,
All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with us for this long, if you're still around. We're gonna keep up the conversations. These are the types of things that are coming out as we're finishing the book, like we said. And we are using the book as basically a starting point, not the finish line in the work that we're doing together. And so we'll be continuing to, kind of dig into the maybe not so obvious sides of things that are happening within scholarly publishing, and particularly from the point of view of the outside world looking in under the microscope at our community.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
So that was our trial run. If you want, let us know what you think. There'll be an email address in the notes for this if we post it. And disruptedscience@gmail.com. You can let us know what you think if you want more of these. If you have questions, if you have topic suggestions, or if you're Robert F. Kennedy Jr., if you want to try to sell us something, send us an email. We'd like some direct marketing from you to see what that looks like. All right. Thanks, Joy.
All right. Thanks. Take
Talk to
care.
you later. Bye.